On July 1st, 2025, witnesses watched something that hadn't happened in 2 millennia, a red heifer ceremony outside Jerusalem. The Temple Institute said it was perfect. Byron Stinson called it flawless, but not everyone agrees. Some say the heifer had a blemish. Others question the priest's lineage. A few claim the location wasn't precise enough. And here's why this matters. If the ceremony was invalid, they'll have to do it again. But if it was valid, the countdown to 2026 has already started. So, which is it? The answer depends on who you ask. Here's the problem with the red heifer ceremony. It has to be absolutely perfect. Not close, not mostly right, perfect. The heifer can't have a single hair that's not red, can't have any blemishes, can't have ever worn a yoke or done any work. The priest performing it must come from the correct priestly lineage. The location must have an unobstructed view of where the Holy of Holies once stood. The fire must be built with specific woods. The mixture must include exact ingredients. One mistake, and the entire ceremony is worthless. And after 2,000 years without practice, getting it right on the first try seems almost impossible. Byron Stinson has been taking care of these red heifers for years. On July 1st, 2025, he shared surprising news in a Facebook post. The Temple Institute actually did it. They performed the real red heifer ceremony. Not a rehearsal, not a practice run. The actual ceremony. Rabbi Artheria Aurel supervised. Byron Stinson wrote, "The ceremony went perfectly with a perfect priest in a place outside of the camp. We used a perfect red heifer. This ceremony was done before Hashem. He is merciful and faithful." Press the subscribe button to stay updated as more details emerge. That sounds definitive, final, complete. But within the religious community, questions started emerging almost immediately. Was the heifer truly examined according to every requirement? Some rabbinical authorities want more documentation, verification from multiple sources, because, according to Jewish law, even the smallest detail matters. And if those details weren't followed exactly, so what actually happened on July 1st? According to Byron Stinson, everything went perfectly. The Temple Institute performed the ceremony. Rabbi Artheria Aurel, a qualified Kohen from the priestly lineage, oversaw every step. The location was outside the camp, just as Numbers 19 requires. The heifer met every qualification. Witnesses were there. They saw it happen. But here's where it gets complicated. The red heifer ceremony isn't like other religious rituals where you can have observers taking photos and videos. This is one of the most secretive ceremonies in Jewish tradition. Even in ancient times, only the designated priest and a small group of officials were allowed to witness it. So, while people were present, the full details haven't been made public. What we do know, the ceremony happened on the Mount of Olives. That's significant, because the location matters just as much as the heifer itself. According to rabbinical interpretation of Numbers 19, the ceremony must be performed east of where the temple stood, across the Kidron Valley, with a direct line of sight to the Temple Mount. The priest needs to be able to see the exact spot where the Holy of Holies once was. Rabbi Isaac Momo of Bonei, Israel, has confirmed this requirement. It's not negotiable. The sight line must be clear and unobstructed, because during the ceremony, the priest has to face the temple location at specific moments. The Temple Institute has been scouting locations for years, finding elevated spots on the Mount of Olives that meet these requirements. Remote areas where the ceremony can be performed away from crowds and distractions. July 1st, they chose their spot. The fire was lit. Cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet thread were added as prescribed. The heifer was burned completely, and the ashes were collected and stored. Byron Stinson called it perfect, done before God, merciful and faithful. But not everyone is convinced the ceremony was valid, because there's a difference between doing a ceremony and doing it correctly. And in Jewish law, that difference is everything. The doubts started quietly, not from outsiders, not from skeptics who don't believe in temple prophecy. The questions came from within the religious community itself, from rabbis, from scholars who've spent decades studying these exact requirements. Their concern? The details. First, the heifer itself. For a red heifer to qualify, it can't have more than 2 non-red hairs on its entire body. Not 3, not 4, 2 maximum. And those hairs can't be in the same follicle. The animal has to be examined under intense scrutiny. Every angle, every patch of skin. Some authorities are asking, was that level of inspection done before July 1st? Was there rabbinical consensus? Because in Jewish law, particularly for something this significant, you don't just trust one person's assessment. You need multiple qualified authorities to confirm. Byron Stinson says the heifer was perfect. But where's the documentation? Where are the signed declarations from multiple rabbis who examined the animal? Then there's the priest. Rabbi Artheria Aurel performed the ceremony. He's identified as a Kohen, part of the priestly lineage descended from Aaron. But being a Kohen isn't automatically enough. The priest also has to be ritually pure, free from certain disqualifications. And in modern times, determining that purity gets complicated. Has Rabbi Aurel been in contact with the dead? Has he entered areas where bodies are buried? Jewish cemeteries, hospitals, certain parts of Jerusalem. All of these create ritual impurity that disqualifies a priest from performing temple ceremonies. The purification process to remove that impurity requires red heifer ashes. See the problem? If there haven't been valid red heifer ashes for 2,000 years, then technically no modern Kohen can be properly purified to perform the ceremony. It's a circular problem. You need the ashes to purify the priest, but you need a purified priest to create the ashes. Some scholars argue there are workarounds, interpretations that allow the ceremony to proceed despite this issue. Others say those workarounds aren't valid. And then there's the biggest question of all, the location. Because this is where things get really specific. Numbers 19 says the ceremony must happen outside the camp. Simple enough, right? Not even close. In ancient times, when the temple was standing, outside the camp meant east of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, on the Mount of Olives. The priest would stand there, face west toward the temple, and perform the ceremony with a direct view of the entrance to the Holy of Holies. That sightline was critical. The priest had to be able to see the temple entrance during specific parts of the ritual. But here's the problem in 2025. There is no temple. The Holy of Holies doesn't exist as a physical structure. So where exactly should the priest be looking? At the Dome of the Rock? At the Temple Mount platform? At some theoretical point beneath the Muslim structures? Different authorities have different answers. Some say the sightline should aim at where the Second Temple once stood. Others argue it should target where the First Temple was, which might not be the exact same spot. A few contend that as long as the general area of the Temple Mount is visible, that's sufficient. The Temple Institute chose a location on the Mount of Olives, elevated, east of the Old City, with a clear view across the valley. But was it the correct spot? Rabbi Isaac Momo of Bonei, Israel, has written extensively about this. He says, the location must allow the priest to see not just the Temple Mount, but the specific place where the altar stood, where the Holy of Holies was positioned. And without archaeological certainty about those exact coordinates, how can anyone be sure they're looking at the right spot? Then there's another issue. The ceremony must happen outside the camp. In temple times, that was clear. The camp was Jerusalem's city limits. Outside meant beyond the walls. But modern Jerusalem is massive. It extends in every direction. So where does outside the camp begin now? At the old city walls? At the municipal boundaries? At some rabbinically determined perimeter? If they chose the wrong spot, even by a few meters, the ceremony might not count. And that's not even the strangest contradiction that's emerged. Here's what nobody's saying out loud. If the July 1st ceremony wasn't valid, they need to do it again. But there's a problem. Red heifers that meet the biblical requirements are extremely rare. Byron Stinson has been raising them for years, And even then, finding one that stays unblemished as it matures is nearly impossible. A single dark hair disqualifies it. A scratch that leaves a mark disqualifies it. Using the animal for any kind of work disqualifies it. The Temple Institute knows this, which is why they've been preparing multiple heifers. Not just one, several candidates, because the chances of getting everything perfect on the first attempt are slim. So if the July ceremony had issues, they likely have backup options. But here's where it gets political. The red heifer ceremony isn't just a religious ritual. It's tied directly to the movement to rebuild the Third Temple. And that means it involves some of the most controversial real estate on the planet. The Temple Mount is currently home to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of the holiest sites in Islam. Any suggestion of changing that status quo creates international tension. Countries watch this closely. Governments issue statements. The entire geopolitical balance of the Middle East can shift based on what happens on that 35-acre platform. Zionist and Messianic Jewish groups have been working toward temple restoration for decades. The Temple Institute has recreated temple vessels, trained priests, prepared everything needed for temple service. The red heifer ashes are the final piece. Because you can't have priests entering the Temple Mount to serve unless they're ritually purified first. And you can't purify them without the ashes, which means whoever controls those ashes controls the timeline for what happens next. So what happens if they have to perform the ceremony again? First, the timeline changes. If the July 1st ceremony wasn't valid, then the 2026 predictions shift. Maybe it's 2027, maybe later. The countdown that some people thought had started, it hasn't begun yet. But if they do perform another ceremony, and this time get it right, things accelerate quickly. The ashes would be used to purify priests. Once purified, those priests could theoretically enter the Temple Mount area and begin preparations for temple service. Not the full temple immediately, but initial steps, ritual practices, establishing a priestly presence. That's when the real complications begin. Because the Temple Mount isn't empty. It's administered by the Jordanian Islamic Waqf. Israeli police control access, but the Islamic authorities manage the site. Any attempt by Jewish priests to perform rituals there would be seen as a direct challenge to that arrangement. We're talking about potential riots, international condemnation, diplomatic crises. Yet for those who believe in biblical prophecy, these ashes represent something that can't be stopped. They see this as divine timing, the pieces falling into place after 2,000 years, whether the world is ready or not. Christian prophecy watchers are paying attention too. Many believe the Third Temple must be built before certain end-times events can occur. A valid red heifer ceremony fits directly into those prophetic timelines. So the question isn't just whether the July ceremony was valid. The question is whether we're watching the beginning of something that will reshape the entire Middle East. And that depends on what happens in the coming months. Because there are signs that another ceremony might already be in the works. Byron Stinson hasn't posted an update since July 1st. The Temple Institute has gone quiet. No new statements. No clarifications about the concerns being raised. Which could mean two things. Either they're confident the ceremony was valid and see no need to respond to critics, or they're already planning the next one, selecting another heifer, confirming the location, waiting for the right moment. The ashes from July 1st exist, but will they be the ashes that change history, or just the first attempt in what becomes a series of ceremonies until they get it absolutely right? Rabbinical debates are happening behind closed doors right now. Decisions are being made about what comes next, and those decisions will determine whether 2000 TCK means something, or whether we're still waiting. The red heifers are still in Byron Stinson's care. The priests are still training. The movement hasn't stopped. It's just a question of when, and whether anyone will know it's happening until it's already done.